Welcome to the Leepa-Rattner Museum in Tarpon Springs, Florida. I'm Marjorie Greene Graff, the docent for today's tour and a former professor at St. Petersburg College. This tour is geared for students who are writing about their museum visit. It's also for those who want to know more about Abraham Rattner's later work, and really for anyone who is interested in learning about this great artist's work. A little bit about the museum first. The Leepa-Rattner Museum was built in 2002 in conjunction with a pairing of Alan Leepa, who was Abraham Rattner's stepson, and St. Petersburg College. This beautiful building was designed by Ed Hoffman, and it references the nautical history of Tarpon Springs. So if you do get a chance to visit the museum, I suggest you go out on the patio and take a look, and you'll feel like you were on a ship. A little bit about our artist, Abraham Rattner. Abraham Rattner was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is about 2 hours north of New York City. He was born in 1893 to parents who had emigrated from Russia. Now, it's really important to understand the history of his family. His father had been studying to be a rabbi and was forced to leave Russia because of the pogroms, which was when the Russians, the Tsarists, rounded up people, mostly Jewish people, forced them into labor camps or into the army. So his parents came to the United States, and his father, as I said, a very studious man, became a baker. Rattner was one of 6 children, and he was fortunate enough to have a good education. He studied in New York City, in Washington, D.C., and ultimately at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And I'm very familiar with this school because I grew up in that city. It is one of the oldest art schools in the country and gives a very classical education. His studies were interrupted by World War I, and Abraham was sent overseas and worked in a camouflage unit for the army. Unfortunately, he was also wounded, and he had to live the rest of his life with the results of this injury. He was able to resume his studies at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and was awarded a scholarship to study in Europe. He spent 19 years in France, which is truly, truly an education unto itself. Some of the artists that he was able to befriend and follow were renowned artist Pablo Picasso, Chaim Soutine, and Marc Chagall. So think about it a minute. Do you know the work of any of these artists? This is important, so if you're writing a paper, you may want to look up some of his influences. And I'll give you a little bit of a background. So Pablo Picasso, of course, very well known for Cubism. Marc Chagall for beautiful floating figures, often referencing his Russian background. And Chaim Soutine, who did exquisite, lush, beautiful still lifes. And one that comes to mind is of a rabbit or hare hanging from a hook. It sounds a little gory, but it's really an exquisite painting, and you can see this if you're ever at the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia. So these were some of Abraham Rattner's influences. He also spent time in Giverny and was able to see the renowned Claude Monet and his work and his environment. So all of these artists, all of this wonderful experience went into the mix to make Abraham Rattner the artist that he was. We're going to see 4 paintings today, very different paintings, mostly from his later works in the 50s and 60s. And I'm going to begin with a painting called Last Judgment. But before I do, I just want to give you a little bit of a background on how to visit a museum and what these labels mean, which is very important as you're viewing your piece. It says that this is a Last Judgment, and it's a triptych. It's a pretty easy word to figure out. This painting is on 3 separate panels. It's so huge that it had to be painted on 3 separate panels. You'll also see that it gives the birthplace of the artist, American, and his dates of birth and death, 1893 to 1978. So that gives you a little bit of a context when you're looking at the piece of art. As I said, this piece is a triptych, and it was painted in response to all of the horrors of World War II, and specifically the atomic bomb. Remember, he's already served in World War I. He has experienced World War II by this time, and now he is just really letting every emotion come out in this painting, The Last Judgment. Many people do express the opinion that Rattner was an expressionist, very much a humanist, concerned with the human spirit. He's also a colorist, and I want to just remind you, if you've taken Understanding Art, or you're taking it now, or if you've taken Design 1, you probably know about the elements and principles of design. So let's just review the elements, because I think we can talk about this painting in those terms. Color, line, shape, texture, space. Now, I don't want you to suggest that the artist sits with that list in their head going through everything as they're painting. But when we discuss it, it's important to know those terms, as well as the principles of design, such as unity, variety, balance. So review your notes on those things as well when you're doing your paper. So what is the color scheme? It's highly intense colors, colors that are almost straight from the tube of paint. You don't see pastel colors in here, like pinks and lavenders. You also don't see very muddy colors, low intensity colors, like grays and browns. He has to almost show you how the atomic bomb burst color, and that's playing out throughout the canvas. Also, line. There's a strong black line in a lot of Rattner's work. A strong stroke that he uses with his brush and pulls the brush through. So there are dense lines and there are also thin lines where the paint is drier on the brush. It has the feeling of fragmentation and stained glass, which is something that he did later on in his career. Remember I said that he was influenced by Marc Chagall? Well, Marc Chagall did a series of stained glass windows, which I was fortunate enough to see at the Hadassah Museum in Israel. And definitely, Rattner was influenced by those stained glass windows that some of his contemporaries made. Look at the areas up here where there's tiny pieces of color and it's all outlined in black line. That very much has that sense of stained glass window, broken glass, fragmentation. We also have one large figure that's swooping through the piece, and the face on that figure is also fragmented, which may be an homage to his longtime friend Pablo Picasso. So here we have a whole series of vivid colors, strong shapes, and this sense of fragmentation and things falling apart. But what unifies this piece, even with all this chaos, all this energy exploding? If you look at the corners and the bottom of the painting, it's very solid and much larger shapes. So this grounds what's going to happen throughout the rest of the piece. This is a really important and significant piece that took Rattner 2 years to paint. He actually rented a studio in Sag Harbor, New York, and it was an old Baptist church. He needed a large studio to work at this scale, and this is where he created this piece. It was later shown both in a gallery in New York City and then at the World's Fair in New York. I hope that you enjoy the first of our 4 selections. The second painting that we're going to explore is called Job from the Bible. And Rattner, like many other artists, used the Bible as inspiration. This piece is much smaller. It's 38 by 51 inches, and it's also oil on canvas. Some of the things that we can carry over from the first painting is the intense color palette and the use of strong line. Now, if you recall from the story of Job, he was a very tortured individual, very much tested by God, and yet he didn't complain. This was his lot in life. But at this point, he's very frustrated, very questioning of what's going on. And maybe some of you feel that way in the environment we are in now, living under this COVID virus, strong emotions, strong sense of frustration. Here we have Job with his head leaning back, his arm almost on his forehead, like, oh my goodness, his hand and his foot pointing upward. One of the things that we have here that we'll see in another painting as well is a strong blue-green background with a lot of oranges and yellows in the figure. If you think about the color schemes that you've learned, these are called what? Correct, complementary colors. We have the strong blue background and the oranges and yellows coming forward. One of the things that he did is treat the figure in a very unusual way. And again, talking about fragmentation, his idea of stained glass, we have that feeling again in the way that he's depicted this very strong thigh, in the foot, and each toe. You can almost feel the curling of the toes and the curling of the figures as he's reaching up. It's an important painting in the genre of Abraham Rattner, and I think that just exploring the way that he has used the figure in a different way reinforces the fact that he is an expressionist. He did not do this in a photorealist way. He did not do this in an abstract way. Other people may have done it in a more classical way, which when we think of biblical paintings, they're also very classical. But no, this has the complete Rattner take on this subject matter. Also think about scale, one of the things that we talk about in the principles of art. The figure is taking up most of the picture plane, and it's being forced in by the sides, so we get a bit of tension just from how he placed the figure. He barely got the arm and the head in the picture plane. It makes Job appear even larger than life, which I think was his intent. Okay, here's a really sweet painting called Bettina. This is a portrait of Rattner's wife. Now remember I said that Rattner was studying in France in the late 20s and early 30s. Up until 39 he was actually in France, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And he met this lovely woman named Bettina, who was a society columnist for the Chicago Tribune. That meant that she would cover fashion for this newspaper, and that enabled them to go to some really classy parties and other events which they might not have been invited to because she was covering all this for her newspaper. They lived very happily in France until 1939, when the Nazis were taking over. Now, most French people did not think that the Germans were going to come into France, and Rattner was one of them, and he sort of thought he could stay. But his family implored him to come back to the United States, and lucky for him and Bettina, they were able to take one of the last ships out of Europe. They settled in New York City, and things were going very well until Bettina became ill, and she died. And so that was really heartbreak for Rattner. He continued to paint, but sporadically, eventually getting back into it. And this is one of the portraits that he did. If you're able to visit the museum, there are several other paintings that are portraits of his lovely wife. We just talked about color scheme when we were talking about Job. Well, this is another example of the blue-orange complementary color scheme. And it's important, if you're able, to actually see these paintings in person, because the clarity of the blue, the strength of the orange come across very differently than you will see in a reproduction or even in a video. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about how color advances and recedes, which is very important in a portrait. Those areas that are closest to us, like the forehead, the nose, the chin, have been painted in a beautiful gold color. And those areas that recede, like the eye sockets, under the nose, under the lip, are in cooler colors like lavenders. So just keep in mind that warm colors like red, yellow, and orange are going to recede, move forward. Cool colors like blues and greens and lavenders are going to recede. And he plays with that in this piece. Again, what kind of style is he painting in? He could have done this also in a classical style or in a photorealist style. But true Abraham Rattner is in an expressionist style. He's also applied some decoration to her clothing. So to agitate the picture frame, he's put a series of dots, and he's picked green as the color for the dots, which play off nicely for the red-orange of her dress. Scale. a little bit out of proportion, but that's again his artistic license to be an expressionist. The head is larger than you would naturally see, but that's the importance of the piece too. He wants to express and exaggerate this part of the portrait. Also how it fits in the picture plane. It's a very close-up cropped portrait of his wife. The last piece we're going to see today is called Parade, and I think it is very, very important to speak of this piece today, which is voting day. This piece starts with a quote at the top, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And where do we see these words? Where do we see life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness? The Declaration of Independence, and that's why we go out and vote, and that's why we go out and protest. And Abraham Rattner was very much for this. This painting was done in the late 60s, 1960s, and there were a lot of protests back then. People were protesting the Vietnam War, which he also approved of the protests. He was very anti-war. People were protesting the environment, even back then. I don't know that we've made huge leaps and bounds. People were protesting civil rights. Now we have Black Lives Matter, but it was civil rights back in the 60s. What else were people protesting? They were protesting hunger. There were so many issues. And the youth of that time, in the 1960s, were very vocal about their protests. And Rattner saw this, and he approved of this. So he did this painting, encouraging people not to be complacent, not to stand back. And so there's several things I want to point out. First of all, there's lots of words. We haven't seen calligraphy in any of his other pieces. And he thought that this was important, and that's why I began with that observation. He also has others, we will overcome, he's actually scratched it into the oil paint, sort of a sgraffito kind of way of painting. On this corner, we have an image that could very well be Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was the wife of President John Kennedy, who was assassinated in the early 60s. Important that he put this figure in there. We also have these masked figures, and he incorporated masks in several of his works. He said that when his wife Bettina died, a part of him died also, and so the mask was a reference to that loss. But it also is that idea that maybe you're not so able to stand out there and protest and be known. So he really is not big on that, of people not speaking up. You have to speak up if there's injustice. We also have this mother figure here holding her baby, and her baby is looking out a little bit fearful, I think. And the woman is looking out off the canvas. The way that he's done some of these faces is almost like a caricature, very linear. So he's used that line that we saw in the first piece, the Last Judgment piece, that use of line to define gnarling teeth, bulging eyes, things that just give it a more austere look. Color scheme, there's a lot of red. Now red can be interpreted as many things, but I think in this case it might be passion. The passion that he feels for the social injustice. And so he set the whole piece against this very vivid red background. Think about why it is important for artists to take a stance on these issues. And just to sort of think of all the pieces that he has, that I presented today that Rattner has created. He took a stance against World War II and the atomic bomb. In the Bible, the injustice to man. And here, in social issues, how it's important to speak up, to have a voice. So it's not just about the paint, the line, the color. It's also about the message that Rattner is sending to the viewer. And this is many, many years after he painted it. So think also about the importance of these pieces of art in the history of mankind. I'm not trying to overemphasize his empathy, but I think it's important to know that he was way more than a painter. He was a human who really loved other humans. I hope that you will have enjoyed the docent tour today. I encourage everyone to come see the pieces in person and to visit other pieces in the collection. Thank you.